Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the forcing out by Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings of Britain's head of the civil service, Sir Mark Sedwill, and what the more clear-cut implications of this are going to be. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So what essentially has happened is that Sedwill has been eased out. It's been a negotiated easing out, presumably to stop him kissing and telling afterwards, and his position given to our chief Brexit negotiator, David Frost. Now, in reality, this is taking an axe to the civil service by having it headed up by a political appointment. And this will only be the beginning. In fact, you could argue the beginning had already started. And I know some other countries have politically appointed senior positions in their civil service, but it's always seemed to me to be very inefficient to be constantly chopping and changing these lead roles on such a regular basis. I mean, you chop and change in a democratic system anyway. The ministers, the people who decide policy, but the people who actually implement it, you need them to have a bit of expertise. And what it means is that these guys will be constantly making mistakes, and the service itself will never learn from these mistakes for a couple of reasons. First of all, the sort of people you'll naturally appoint, politically, are likely to be yes men. And the other thing is, their replacements are political rivals who are not exactly going to share the things they've learned from their own time in the role. The British civil service has an international reputation for efficiency, another reputation that I fear our government are tossing onto the bonfire right now. And before I take a look at why the V Sedwill out, I want to consider the appointment of his successor, which isn't going to be a successor in the strictest sense of the term, because from what I can gather, this may not be quite on the button, potentially more details will emerge over time. Although David Frost is going to take over as head of the civil service and is going to take over as head of the National Security Agency, which is a monstrous appointment that I'll go over in a bit, I don't think his title is going to be Cabinet Secretary, which is what Sir Mark Sedwill is. So I think that role seems to have been got rid of somehow, unless I'm missing something. That would suggest the role of Cabinet Secretary is not actually going to exist. But anyway, the key thing is that Frost is being rewarded with their job of head of the civil service and head of the NSA and a peerage. So quite clear that Boris Johnson is extremely happy with him, as of course is Dominic Cummings. Now ask yourself on what basis. Because he was appointed chief negotiator for the EU talks. He is Boris Johnson's Europe advisor. Now, we have made zero progress on that front. If you assume that it was his role to find a way through the obstacle course of international diplomacy, then he failed. He has objectively failed to move us even tentatively towards deal with the EU. In fact, we are further back from a deal than we were in January. Now, you could argue that that isn't his fault. Fine, okay, that's all right. Not going to argue with that. But the point is that he hasn't succeeded in the role. So if he was given an important role, absolutely crucial role, and didn't succeed in it, regardless of the reason, why is he being now given a peerage and much more important jobs? Because, of course, his success was not measured in terms of unlocking the trade talks, which have been a massive flop, but because his job was to keep parroting Johnson's Brexit lines in order to shore up his support amongst the Brexit believers propping him up. Now ask yourself this. Let's say you were to just put someone in David Frost's position, anyone you pulled off the street, and you put them in that position when he was appointed. Would someone with no diplomatic experience whatsoever, no experience of government, no experience of politics, but someone who was willing just to parrot what Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson told them to parrot, would they have done any worse in the role of Brexit chief negotiator, given that we've made zero progress? I would argue not. I would argue they could have just got anyone to do that job, and where we are now would still be where we are now. In other words, Johnson's idea of a successful aide is being able to parrot a few lines and not actually achieve anything of substance. And that is who he is saying should run the civil service and the National Security Agency. Except, of course, he will not be running those things, will he? David Frost is to be appointed head of the Civil Service, head of the NSA, but still remain the UK's chief Brexit negotiator. He's not going to be moved from one job to another this September when Sedwill steps down. I mean, how can someone do two really demanding full-time roles? The answer, of course, is that you can't, and it is not intended to be possible. It's also clear that his new role will be that of figurehead only. Dominic Cummings will be taking over Sedwill's job in reality, but they will use Frost as the public face of it. Dominic Cummings gets another monkey. Frost will be told what decisions have been made, and he will just be the gopher charged with making it official, just like Boris Johnson. In fact, Frost said that the Brexit negotiations, which are going nowhere, in reasonably entertaining fashion, are to remain his top priority. So his top priority is to be talks which have already failed, and not coordinating government departments that run healthcare, social care, police forces, schools, courts, military, road, rails, foreign affairs. None of these things are important enough to distract him from his pointless failed talks with the EU. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And like I said, this is potentially going to be the pattern across Whitehall. First the Cabinet Secretary and then probably permanent secretaries who are the heads of government departments. They'll be next. In fact, actually, several of them have already been made casualties of Dominic Cummings' purge, really, when you think about it. That's what I mean. Sedwill, ironically, wasn't really the first. And all replaced with inexperienced toadies, no doubt. If not a history of failure behind them, then at least no record of success that justifies that position. And the only qualifications will be blind obedience to the man-child in number 10. And, of course, his organ grinder, Dominic Cummings, and a complete disregard for the country, constitution and the law. Now, occasionally they may get someone who fits the bill there and is quite intelligent and efficient, but the vast majority of the time, when you appoint yes men, that's really all you're going to get. Because one of the reasons why Sedwill was eased out was resisting Dominic Cummings' attempts, amongst other things, to force civil servants to break the law. For example, last year in the acquisition and use of personal data, there's been a campaign of anonymous briefings against Sedwill. Dominic Cummings does this a lot. Gives briefings to journalists, but they're to be, not attributed to anyone. We always know they're from Cummings. And it's been going on for some time. Because as well as blaming the scientists, nurses, doctors, teachers, members of the public for the coronavirus failings of the government and, the bubbled-brained ministers in charge of each department, the government has also been blaming Sedwill as well as laying the ground to justify getting rid of him. And as others have pointed out, this was grossly unfair because civil servants are not allowed to defend themselves in public. In fact, there's an awful lot of people who have been blamed that are not allowed to defend themselves in public. If a nurse or doctor, for example, says anything on the PPE, then they are suspended, potentially even dismissed. And this has already happened. But with civil servants, they are not supposed to speak publicly about their work. And it's sort of like the deal between senior civil servants and their ministers. You don't discuss them in public, and in return, they don't discuss ministers in public. Of course, it's not really like a covenant that can be broken by this ministerial behaviour, because if civil servants decide sod it and begin to talk to the papers about all the sordid details, well, they will be sacked. Then there's the role of the head of the National Security Agency. Now, what this means now is that this agency is going to be run by the political appointment of someone who is believed by MI5 and MI6 to be a threat to national security. Boris Johnson. A man who is suppressing the release of a report into foreign attacks on our democratic processes and who has taken Russian money for doing so. The consequences for this action are really quite monstrous. It is putting the national security in very serious jeopardy. And all I can think about when I've been thinking this through, all I can think about is that maybe, the only hope is maybe this will be short-lived if the Conservatives get rid of Boris Johnson sooner rather than later. Of course, this is all being driven by Dominic Cummings, of course. But there is every reason to believe that once Johnson goes, that his successor would not keep Cummings in post, or indeed anywhere near government. Dominic Cummings is not popular amongst Conservative MPs. He's not even that popular amongst much of the cabinet. And it may well be that the subsequent leadership election that is triggered, MPs say to the leading candidates, I'm not going to support you unless you've promised to throw Dominic Cummings out on his ear if you win. I mean, Michael Gove, for example, you would think has certainly got no love for Cummings. Cummings has not been kind about him in the past. In the meantime, when you consider that we are about to have people in charge of our civil service with a record of recent failure, namely Frost and Cummings, there's a good and a bad side to this as well. Now, the bad side first, so I can end on the good. The bad side is that it means that our civil service is about to become a lot less efficient. In the route to promotion, if the qualities you're looking for are toadying and political, then you will encourage an atmosphere of backbiting. You will also kill off frank discussions that point out the flaws in plans, devil's advocacy, that is needed whenever you're formulating any complex plan to be able to point out where the stumbling blocks are so that you can clear the way. Any such behaviour will be labelled as being negative, not getting on board, and won't be tolerated. That will mean that inevitably you go ahead with planning and then you're surprised when it goes tits up because you never foresaw the stumbling blocks because you dissuaded people from talking about them. Buying the wrong sort of satellites for our navigation needs will be a drop in the ocean of embarrassing failures waiting for Brexit Britain. But this is also potentially the good side in a twisted sort of way, because what Johnson and Cummings plan to do is nothing short of complete constitutional vandalism of our country, really. A complex task for which they are surrounded by opponents. And they've just appointed Mr. Magoo as chief lookout. So as monstrous as their plans are, and they will doubtless destroy a great deal, they might be limited in just how much damage they can do before being ousted, because they are getting rid of efficient, experienced people and efficient, well-working, effective systems as well. Replacing them with yes men and chopping and changing as the political wind suits them. Putting in place people who historically are not exactly known to shine in such tasks. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.